Right.
So Edward, we're talking about I'm using the word danger. That's the word that comes to my mind, but that obviously already implies a certain judgment, I don't know, or perceived idea that people are testing the boundaries of their fear. I think that's really where it came from, is we were looking at, the pros and cons of fear, and that fear is something that works for us because it can galvanize us into certain actions. But we also know that fear works for us because it says danger is ahead, watch out, be cautious. And then there are those people who challenge that limit, that boundary, where our natural inclination is to pull back and to say, no, it's not wise to, jump off a cliff. Well, no, if I have a certain kit on, then I'm willing to test that boundary and do it. Even though other people might have got injured, and I think about skateboarders. I think skateboarders, to me, are some of the bravest and stupidest people, because you look at these incredible feats that they do, these amazing things. But I think, how many times did you fall to get to that point where you achieved that particular trick? And I mean, we can keep chatting. So we can go backwards and forwards. So that's my opening thoughts. What's been sort of mulling over in your mind?
Yeah, I found this quite an interesting question, and it reminded me of the back of the Comrades T-shirt.
Oh, right.
The only way to discover the limits of the possible is to go beyond them to the impossible, and that's on the shirt from 2000.
Okay.
Which was at the turn of the century, which was quite interesting because the quote comes from Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote The Space Odyssey. And, I think it's quite interesting. The only way to know the limits of the possible is the impossible. And I thought about extreme sports and stuff like that. And I thought, well, actually, people don't really take risks. They've worked out what they need to do, what the risks are, and they've eliminated most of this risk. Base jumping might sound exciting, but they've worked it out. Some of the stunts people do might seem exciting and dangerous, but they've worked it out. You don't see a lot of people dying doing that sort of stuff. And then I thought about, well, who really took risks? And if you think about sailing in the olden times, the guys that set off to discover America or whatever it was, they had no idea when they would land. They had no idea what they were getting into. And if you think about the guys that started exploring the internal parts of Africa, they had no idea what they were going to find. So I think that was true risk-taking and discovering the limits of the possible by going beyond them. Because those guys on those boats, didn't know whether they were going to fall off the end of the world, whatever. It must have been incredibly brave to just go into that unknown. And we don't really go into the unknown anymore, do we? Most of it's known. And then I thought, I was really pleased about using that shirt because I thought, well, I could show my commitment to Wisdom's chaps. I give you my shirt off my back.
Virtually, at least.
Yeah. And then I thought about a guy I met quite a few times, actually, on multi-day races. He's a runner and a climber. And he's the first person, well, I think the first Brit to climb the highest mountain on every continent on the first attempt. And he's a really interesting guy. And we were talking about Everest. And 1 in 10 people die climbing Everest. That's the current ratio. It used to be less, and the average over the whole lot, and I think about 4,000 people have summited Everest, and the average is 6%. So the average now is higher. And I was talking to him about, surely you're in a really risky sport, because he's also climbed K2. 1 in 4 people die climbing K2. And he says, no, I'm not. He says, I know what I'm doing. He says, the trouble with Everest is people think they can do it because other people have done it, and they don't take the proper care. And that's why it's now 10% of people dying, whereas in the early days, it was a lot less. And I think it's true for a lot of things, isn't it? Someone does it fully understanding the risk, fully appreciating the risk, with the fear that they're going into the unknown. So they're prepared, they take the right steps. And I think someone on here once said, things don't go wrong, they start wrong. And the original people going into the unknown, the first people climbing Everest, took all the steps because they had that fear. And the people following think, oh, it's been done before, it's easy. And they don't have the fear, they don't appreciate the risks, they don't take the precautions, and they die or fail at business or whatever it is. So I think, yeah, that's my initial ramblings.
Yeah, Edward, I find that I really love this idea that, well, the point that you've raised, that it's the complete unknown that holds the greatest fear and the greatest risk. And that as explorers and people who ventured out in the centuries before us, and it just reminded me, obviously South Africa being a settled nation, that there have been people who have come from all over the world into and arrived here not knowing. And I think of my own history, the generations that led to where I am. So my family arrived in South Africa via a shipwrecked sailor. So he was a Portuguese sailor on a British East India ship, heading out, of course, on, around the Horn of, around the tip of Africa, and were shipwrecked along with about 13 other ships because there was a terrible, terrible storm just off the Eastern Cape, and almost everybody died. And he managed to crawl up onto the beach in the sort of mid 1700s, and here he was, literally. I mean, there's nothing there. It's not like there's a little village he can pop into and
get some snacks,
buy the newspaper in a castle. So then he wended his way to Cape Town, found a wife, and the rest is history. He was a Ferreira, and those of you who are in South Africa will know Ferreiras are a dime a dozen in South Africa, and we all stem from this one ancestor. So yeah, that's and then I also think about my husband's family. Their letters were written between the husband to be here in South Africa and his wife to be in England. They'd met in South Africa, but she'd gone back to England. And then he moved again to the Eastern Cape. And again, there was nothing. They went there as the Surgeon General. There wasn't really houses, there's no plumbing, there's nothing. And she's never been there. And he says, I'm building you a house. And once I've built the house, then you can come. So basically 2 years later, letters going backwards and forwards. She then gets on a ship with her little trunk. And I think the ship journey took 2 or 3 months. And then she comes around, lands at a port she's never been to, hoping that her letter telling her husband to be that when she's arriving is actually going to be there. As it turns out, he did get the letter, but he was waiting in the wrong place. So she did arrive, there was no one there. And there she was sitting on her little trunk, and then they have to get in a horse and buggy and go, no roads, putted, rutted roads, from Durban, 600, 700 kilometers south into the middle of nowhere, start a life that she has no idea what it's about. So you're right. I mean, I'm telling long stories about this absolute unknown. And I just think of this trepidation, this intrepid people, these that just say, oh, well, I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. If I don't know, I'll figure it out.
And I think that's the key, isn't it? Is having those internal resources. Like a friend of mine, strange enough, she's South African, but she was living in England, and I think she'd come over with her parents, perhaps, but she travelled a lot. And when she was in Australia, she met a guy from New Zealand, and they kind of fell in love. But she went back to England, and he kept pestering her to move to New Zealand, and she wouldn't, because it was too much of a wrench. Because she was settled in the UK. She'd been in the UK as a child. She was probably late 20s, got a good job, had belonged to a running club in South London, which is where I met her, and she was settled in what she was doing. And this guy kept pestering her to move, and she wouldn't. She wouldn't, and anyhow, she then met me, and went down the slippery road of running ultra marathons. Until then, she'd run half marathons, and she'd done the London Marathon a couple of times. And I persuaded her to get into ultras. And then she wanted, with some of her friends, to become the first ladies team to finish the London to Brighton, which is very similar to your comrades in distance, but completely different in number of supporters, etc. And they trained as a group, and I helped them train. She was second lady in the London to Brighton, and our team was the first ladies team ever to finish. And she turned around to me, she said, you know what, Edward, if I can do that, I can move to New Zealand. And a few months later, she moved to New Zealand, married the guy, and I'm pleased to say they've got 2 children. They're absolutely loving being in America, in New Zealand. And despite her being quite a lot older now, she's winning races and loving her running, loving her family life. But it was just that belief in herself that she could cope with that move and cope with the unknown and conquer that big fear, because it was a big fear for her, making that commitment, making that move.
Yeah.
And it was just having that, oh, if I can do that, if I can take on that big challenge, if I've got that in me, well, going to New Zealand's a piece of cake. I did worry, in case it didn't work out. then she might blame me. Yeah. But I do think a lot of what we see as being dramatic, being brave, being whatever, isn't, because they've had the fear there and they've worked it out. But I take your point about the skateboarders. You know, around here we've got lots of kids on skateboards, always trying tricks and things. I've never seen one of them execute a trick yet.
But they'll die trying.
I mean, fortunately, they're young, aren't they? So when they fall over, you know, it's just a graze. When you get older, you fall over, you break things.
Yeah, so I want to come back to that as well, because when I was thinking about this topic, I was reminded of an article, and I haven't been able to find it, but it struck me at the time. They were talking about, it was actually not an article, it was in a book. So that's why I can't remember which book it was in. But it was saying that we as human beings are designed, or certainly seek a certain amount of risk as our go-to. And they gave the example of Australia. And Australia has a lot of rules and regulations to protect its citizens. So I don't know if you've ever been to Australia, Edward, but I mean, walking down the promenade or down the pathway, there's a line down, and even on the pathway, you have to stick to the left. Yes, I think they also drive on the left. And then oncoming traffic must come on the other side. So you literally are not allowed to bump into each other, and walked along those paths. And I've had people glare at me or tell me that I must move over because I'm on the wrong side of the path. And that's just a silly example, but there are lots of very strict rules to protect people, you know, so that they don't die and they don't get hurt. And so there's been a study apparently on, so does that mean that fewer people die in Australia from accidents because of all these rules and regulations? And in reality, the same percentage of people in Australia die from accidents as everywhere else in the world. And what accounts for that is that they don't die from those things because they're safe. But it's your point about, because they think they're safe around those things, they push the boundaries in other areas. So it's almost like you're seeking that place of risk and fear to, you know, Ivan used the word, people say, oh, I feel alive. When I feel that, I feel alive. It feels like I'm doing something exciting and brave, and I can tell my grandchildren about it.
But yeah, that thing about feeling alive, you might remember I played a song about the Kalahari race. I think the soundtrack wasn't very good, but there it says it's the place I feel alive, I come alive. And for me, it's true. It's where I do come alive, because I'm challenging myself, but actually in a safe place. Well, it's not. You can mess it all up, but it's very difficult to do it. I mean, a friend of mine unfortunately did mess it all up and spent a week in an induced coma in a hospital because she got severely dehydrated and almost died. But I think you're right. You know, we need some bit of adrenaline rush somewhere, whether it's a jumping off a building, or whether it's, you know, trudging through a desert, or whether it's, you know, sometimes we say stupid things in meetings, don't we, just to get a reaction out of people. Or be controversial just for the sake of being controversial. And I think in some way we need that. Otherwise, it's just boring, the same, isn't it? And the same isn't nice. You know, it's like if you do something all the time, it doesn't give you the same buzz as if you do something occasionally. It's like strawberries. If you had strawberries every single day of the week, you wouldn't like strawberries. But if you have them in the summer, boy, do they taste nice.
Yeah, it's the strawberry pickers and the chocolatiers who they've had enough. They won't ever have another strawberry or chocolate in their lives.
Yeah, yeah.
And it just, the other thing that I wanted us to think about, and it goes back maybe a little bit to your story of the lady that moved to New Zealand, is, you know, we've been talking about the physical and adventurous type risks, but what about the emotional risks? You spoke about speaking up in a meeting, and you know, are we tempted, and do we try in terms of our own personal growth to stretch those ourselves? You know, and you spoke yesterday about fear of public speaking, and whether people then do risk putting themselves in positions where they feel vulnerable or they feel afraid in order to grow internally in some way, or whether that fear does limit people, you know, whether that is a greater fear that I'm now putting my inner self at risk.
I think there's a range of people, aren't there? Because there are some people that are satisfied with mediocrity. They never push the boundaries. And there are others who, like me, for example, you know, I'm probably quite nice and comfortable where I am in Camborne, and next year I'm going to move somewhere I don't even know because I'm a bit bored. And I want some difference, and that's not risky at all, because, you know, England's England, and people are nice in County Durham where I'm going, and you know, I know the rules of how society works. Someone was telling me that about your Australian story. They moved to Australia, built their own house, and everyone kept saying, "Have you put your fence up yet? Have you put your fence up yet?" And they couldn't understand why they were going on about the fence. But apparently in Australia, there's loads of rules about how you erect your fence and all that sort of stuff, and it defines your boundaries. And they didn't do it, and they spent 2 years in legal arguments because they didn't understand the rules. Whereas, you know, in the UK, I understand the rules. So even though it's a change, it's not a major change. It's not as though I'm going to go and live in the bush in, I don't know, Botswana or something. You know, I know the rules where I am. So, but some people never ever leave the village they grew up in. So some people like to push the boundaries, and I think it's true. You know, life begins at the edge of your comfort zone. You get too comfortable, you stop living. And that's probably because of our background. You know, we would have been, if you were a wildebeest, you're grazing along quite nicely. A lion chases you, you chase off, and then a few minutes later, you're back grazing again. And we've lost that. Nothing chases us, does it? Yeah. But we're designed, aren't we, to our heart rate can go up massively. You know, sitting here, we've got quite a low heart rate, but it can almost double.
Yeah.
And perhaps we need that. And then it's good flush out of all the endorphins and stuff like that. And then it goes back to, and I think we need that. Well, I do anyhow. I don't jump off buildings, but I like pushing myself to limits. You know, whether that's engaging in different things, whether that's saying yes when someone asks me to do a talk, or whether that's saying yes when someone asks me to volunteer looking after a lot of teenagers. That is fear in itself, you know. and think about children. They learn by testing the boundaries.
Yeah.
You know, as they're growing up, they like to test the rules. But as long as they don't test them too much, they grow up all right. If they test them overly much, they end up in prison.
Yeah. Well, and I think that points to consequences, doesn't it? Is that, there are natural boundaries and legal boundaries over which if you step your, I think James Dobson talks about your big hairy toe, you know, if your big hairy toe goes over the line, well, you know, then there are going to be consequences, and the rules of nature and the universe, and legal ramifications and whatever else may then be visited on us, and then hopefully you learn from those consequences. Yeah, so it does make, if you I think about, so as you were talking, I was thinking about lockdown and COVID times this year, and my husband was saying, he as he was walking the one day, he was just thinking about all the things, all the new skills that he's learnt this year, because you're thrown into the fire, and so you have to start cooking. And he said it was just, you know, sort of an endless list of things, and I realized the same, and I'm still learning, and so it's an interesting thing, as you say, is that when you open yourself up to that learning, it almost becomes, I want to say, its own drug, because there's such a sense of accomplishment when and it's not easy. I always think about learning to ride a bike. You know, if you say, oh, it's easy as learning to ride a bike. Well, I never found it easy to learn to ride a bike. But once I've done it, then you've got it. You never forget it. And yeah, so.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've come across people that haven't engaged with Zoom.
Yes.
You know, they're business people that I used to meet networking, and they've kind of shied away from Zoom because they don't like technology, or they find it difficult, because it's an artificial interaction, isn't it? And you think, well, they're missing out on so much, because, you know, here we are, you're in South Africa, I'm in the UK, and later on I'm going up to Northern England, to Newcastle, which is, you know, hundreds of miles away from me. Friday I'm going to pop across to Australia. So yeah, and day before yesterday I heard from people from America, from South Africa, from Spain, all over the place. So those people that aren't embracing the new technology, well, one, their businesses are probably suffering, but they're missing that richness. Because, you know, even though South Africa and the UK drive on the same side of the road, and most people in South Africa speak the same language, you know, the culture is so different, isn't it? You know, the attitudes are so different, and that's a richness that I think people miss by being afraid of using Zoom. And what's there to be afraid of? It's not going to kill you. It's not a saber-toothed tiger.
And maybe let's. I know it might only still be the two of us tomorrow, but I don't know if you want to carry on, Edward.
It's my drug, because otherwise I'll just lie in bed and do nothing. And actually, the nice thing is, tomorrow afterwards I'm going to go running, and I'm seeing some stunning sunrises. You know, I set off in the pitch black with a head torch, and by the time I get back, you know, the sun's up, and there's nothing more beautiful than being out running when the sun comes up.
Stunning. I mean, that is a drug in itself, isn't it?
Yes, so I'm happy to keep talking tomorrow.
Lovely. Okay. So my suggestion for our topic tomorrow then is technology. Because there is a fear around technology. And so I don't know how to frame the question, but maybe let's just launch in, no matter whether there's a question or not. I'll do an email, but I just think because technology is in fact only going to get faster and more, and if you're not on Zoom now, and even if you're 60 or 70, you're going to still live another 10, 15, 20 years. How much technology is going to come your way in that period of time? And what are you now shutting yourself off from because you're not embracing new technology? So that's the question that's sort of framing in my mind. I don't know how to take it further, but let's
technology. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I suggest a subject for another time, just to plant it in your mind? When we were talking the other day about, I forget what it was, but it was about fear. And Verne and you talked about things that you were motivated by the fear. I think hers was a fear that she couldn't provide for her son's education. I forget what yours was. But I thought, well, that's funny, isn't it? Because I would have been motivated by a desire to provide my son's education. So I wondered whether we could somehow discuss carrots and sticks. Are we motivated by fear, or are we motivated by moving towards something?
Lovely. Well, that's perfect, because let's talk about that on Friday, and then that will wrap up our year.
Okay, brilliant.
Lovely.
I will see you tomorrow.
You will. Thanks, Edward. Nice to chat. It's amazing we can come up with just the two of us.
Yeah, we filled the time up.
We certainly did. Okay, have a good day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.